Welcome to the AgroScience AI podcast. In today's episode, taming crop killers with tiny allies. We're going deep into the world of biological control.
It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and we're going to be exploring how these like tiny microorganisms, the little guys,
The microscopic world.
yeah, exactly how they can help us fight plant diseases.
It's like having this this unseen army working for us.
I like that. An unseen army. So we've got these two journal articles to kind of guide us on this deep dive. The first one's called Review on Concepts and Biological Control of Plant Pathogens. It's published back in 2014.
That's a good foundational one. Gives us the basics.
Yeah, lays the groundwork.
Yeah.
Then the second one is called Development of Biofungicides for Sustainable Agriculture, From Screening to Market.
Ah, so this one's more recent.
Yeah, 2022.
Yeah.
So it's going to take us a bit further, from the lab to the fields, which is really what we want to see. These solutions actually making a difference out there.
Absolutely. And I think before we get, too deep into the specifics, it's important to step back and really grasp the scale of the problem we're dealing with here.
Yeah, paint the picture for us.
Plant diseases, they're not messing around. They can wipe out a significant portion of global food production,
We're talking serious losses.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking 10% or even more in some cases.
Wow, that's a huge amount of food.
And it has a ripple effect, right? Food security, especially with a growing global population.
Right. And, we've talked about this before on the show, but just relying on chemical pesticides to fight these diseases it's not really a sustainable solution.
You're absolutely right. It comes with its own set of problems.
Yeah, environmental harm residues on our food. And then there's the whole issue of pesticide resistance.
Yeah, the pathogens, they're smart. They adapt.
It's like arms race.
Exactly. We're constantly trying to stay one step ahead.
So where does biological control fit into all this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Biological control. It's about using nature's own tools, harnessing these natural enemies of plant pathogens to keep them in check.
It's like fighting fire with fire, but on a microscopic level.
Exactly. And these biocontrol agents, they can be bacterial fungi, even yeasts.
And they each have their own sort of like unique way of tackling the problem.
Right. Different mechanisms, different strategies.
So let's dive into that a bit. What are some of the ways that these tiny warriors actually fight plant diseases?
Okay, well, one of the main mechanisms is something called antibiosis.
Antibiosis.
Yeah, and this is where the biocontrol agent, it actually produces antibiotics.
So it's like they're waging chemical warfare.
Precisely. They release these compounds that inhibit the growth of the harmful pathogens.
Wow, so it's like a targeted attack.
And a good example of this is Bacillus subtilis. Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, Bacillus subtilis rings a bell.
So this bacterium, it produces a compound called iturin A.
Iturin A.
And that's really effective against a whole range of fungal pathogens.
So it's like a broad spectrum antibiotic for plants.
You could think of it that way.
That's fascinating. So we've got these bacteria producing antibiotics. What else is in their arsenal?
Well, another mechanism is competition.
Competition, okay.
Yeah, and this is where the biocontrol agent, it essentially outcompetes the pathogens for resources.
Resources like?
Nutrient space, all the things that those pathogens need to survive and thrive.
So it's like they're crowding them out.
Exactly. They're taking up all the space, all the food, and the pathogens, they just can't establish themselves.
So it's not always about a direct attack. Sometimes it's about controlling the environment.
That's a great way to put it. And this is especially important in the rhizosphere, that area around the plant roots.
Right, the rhizosphere. It's like a whole ecosystem down there.
Yeah, it's a bustling marketplace. And these beneficial microorganisms, they're competing with the harmful ones for space and resources.
Wow. So it's a constant battle happening beneath the surface.
It really is. And then there's another mechanism which I think is particularly fascinating. It's called induced resistance.
Induced resistance. Okay, I'm intrigued.
So this is where the biocontrol agent, it actually triggers the plant's own defense mechanisms.
So it's like it's boosting the plant's immune system.
Exactly. It's like giving the plant a heads up, hey, there's a threat coming, get ready to fight.
That's amazing. So these microorganisms, they can actually communicate with the plants in a way.
Well, it's not exactly communication in the way we think of it, but they're definitely interacting and influencing the plant's responses.
And it's not just about fighting off pathogens either, right? I mean, we were talking about some of these microorganisms that can actually promote plant growth.
Absolutely. There's a whole category of biofertilizers, which we could talk about another time. But yeah, some of these microorganisms, they can help plants access nutrients, improve soil health, all sorts of things.
This is like a win-win situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're getting disease control, and you're also getting these added benefits.
So it sounds like we've got a pretty diverse team of microbial warriors at our disposal.
We do. And the research is ongoing. Scientists are constantly discovering new beneficial microorganisms and exploring their potential.
So the possibilities are really endless.
They are. But before we get too carried away, it's important to acknowledge that there are challenges when it comes to actually using these biocontrol agents in agriculture, bringing them from the lab to the field.
Right, real-world application, it's always a hurdle.
One of the biggest challenges is consistency, making sure that these microorganisms perform as well out in the field as they do in those controlled lab conditions.
Right, because the field is a much more complex environment.
Absolutely. There's so many variables, weather, soil type, other microorganisms all playing a role.
So it's like trying to control a very complicated experiment.
And then there's the challenge of production and formulation.
Wow.
How do we mass produce these biocontrol agents? How do we create formulations that are stable and effective?
Right, because it's not just about having the right microorganism. It's also about making it practical for farmers to use.
And then, of course, there's the cost factor. Biocontrol products, they often have to compete with chemical pesticides, which are often cheaper.
Right, and farmers are always looking at the bottom line.
Exactly. So making these biocontrol products economically viable is really important.
So it's a balancing act between effectiveness, sustainability, and affordability.
And we can't forget about the regulatory hurdles. Getting these biocontrol products approved for use, it can be a long and expensive process.
Yeah, bureaucracy can definitely slow things down.
But despite all these challenges, both articles highlight some really encouraging progress that's being made.
Yeah, give us some good news.
Well, there are quite a few biocontrol products that are already commercially available and being used successfully by farmers.
Like, what are some examples?
Well, one that we've already mentioned is Serenade. Remember that one based on Bacillus subtilis?
Yeah, the antibiotic producer.
Exactly. So Serenade, it's actually really popular for controlling post-harvest diseases in fruits.
So after the fruits are picked, Serenade helps keep them fresh and prevents them from rotting.
Precisely.
Wow.
And because Bacillus subtilis produces those spores, remember, Serenade is really easy to store and apply.
So practicality is a big plus.
Absolutely. And then there's another product called Contans WG.
Contans WG.
This one's based on a fungus called Coniotherium minitans.
Now that's a mouthful.
It is, but this fungus is a real specialist in fighting white mold, which is a serious problem for a lot of crops.
So it's like a targeted weapon against white mold.
Exactly. So these are just a couple of examples, but there are many more biocontrol products out there and more being developed all the time.
That's really encouraging to hear. So it seems like we're on the right track.
I think we are, but it's important to remember that the effectiveness of these biocontrol agents, it's not just about the microorganism itself.
Right, it's about the whole system.
Exactly. The plant itself plays a role. Its species, its genetics, its overall health can all influence how well a biocontrol agent works.
So it's like a team effort.
Exactly. And the pathogen itself is also a factor. Its type, its virulence, its own adaptations can all influence the biocontrol agent's success.
So it's a constant back and forth, this evolutionary arms race.
And then, of course, we have to consider the environment, temperature, moisture, soil type. All of these things can impact how well these biocontrol agents work.
It really highlights the complexity of these systems.
It does, and it underscores the need for a more holistic approach to biological control, taking all these factors into account.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Not at all. It's about understanding the whole web of interactions and finding those sweet spots where biocontrol can be most effective.
Okay, so we've talked about the why, the what, and the how of biological control. But let's really zoom in now and take a closer look at these microscopic mechanisms at play.
Okay, let's unravel those mysteries.
We talked about antibiosis earlier, those microorganisms that produce antibiotics to fight pathogens. It's like a microscopic chemical warfare.
Precisely. And it's not just bacteria that do this. Some fungi also produce compounds that inhibit the growth of pathogens.
So it's a multi-pronged attack with different microorganisms wielding different weapons.
And remember that fierce competition we talked about? Well, that's happening all the time in the rhizosphere.
That bustling marketplace around the plant roots?
Exactly. It's a constant battle for resources and the beneficial microorganisms they need to be strong competitors to survive.
So it's about being both offensive and defensive.
Absolutely. And then there's that other clever strategy-induced resistance.
Where the biocontrol agents trigger the plant's own defense mechanisms.
That's the one. And it's fascinating how they can actually prime the plant to be more resistant to infection.
It's like giving them a boost to their immune system.
Exactly. And the really amazing thing is that this can have systemic effects, meaning the entire plant benefits, not just the area where the biocontrol agent is present.
Wow, so it's like a ripple effect spreading throughout the plant.
And finally, we have the most dramatic mechanism of all, parasitism.
Cue the scary music.
Some biocontrol agents, they actually attack and devour those harmful pathogens.
We talked about trichoderma species being particularly good at this, right?
Yeah, they use their those thread-like structures to wrap around the pathogen and essentially digest it.
It's a bit gruesome, but effective.
Nature can be brutal sometimes, but it's also incredibly fascinating.
So we've got this whole arsenal of microbial warriors, each with its own unique set of skills and strategies.
And as we explore further, we'll see how these tiny allies are being put to work in real-world agricultural settings, making a difference in the fight against plant diseases.
Well, I'm definitely ready to learn more about that. So let's dive into some real-world applications in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm excited to share some examples with you.
All right, let's take a short break and we'll be right back with part two. Okay, so we've got all these amazing microbes, these tiny warriors ready to protect our crops. But how are they actually being used in agriculture today? Like, are we just like spraying them on the fields like a regular pesticide?
Well, it's not quite that straightforward.
Yeah.
It's more about strategic deployment, I guess you could say,
Oh.
taking into account that the specific plant, the pathogen, the environment, all of that.
Right, the whole picture, the pathosystem.
Exactly. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
So let's talk about some specific examples then. Like you mentioned Serenade earlier. That's one of the commercially available products.
Yeah, Serenade, that's a great example. It's based on Bacillus subtilis.
The one that produces those spores.
Exactly. So it's really popular for controlling post-harvest diseases in fruits.
Post-harvest, so like after those fruits have been picked.
Right, exactly. So, after they're harvested, Serenade helps to keep them fresh and prevents them from rotting.
So it's like a protective shield for the fruit.
You could say that. And because it's based on those spores, it's easy to store and apply, which is really important for growers.
Right. Practicality is key.
Absolutely. And then another example is Contans WG.
Contents WG, okay.
This one's based on a fungus, actually, called Coniotherium minitans.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but it's a very effective biocontrol agent. It's a specialist in fighting white mold.
White mold. I've heard that's a real problem for a lot of crops.
Oh, yeah. It can be devastating. So Contans WG is a really valuable tool for growers who are dealing with that.
So it sounds like we're seeing some real progress in terms of, bringing these solutions to the market. But are there other ways to utilize these beneficial microorganisms besides just spraying them on directly?
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole range of techniques.
Wow.
One that's really interesting is biofumigation.
Biofumigation, okay.
Yeah. So this involves incorporating specific plant species into the soil. And these plants, they release compounds that when they break down, they can actually suppress soil-borne pathogens.
So it's like you're planting these defender crops alongside the ones you're trying to protect.
Well, not exactly alongside, but you're basically using plants to manipulate the soil environment.
Okay, so it's like building natural defenses into the soil itself.
Exactly. And then there's another technique called biodisinfection.
Biodisinfection.
And this one involves using a lot of organic matter to create conditions that are unfavorable for many pathogens.
So you're basically like creating a hostile environment for those disease-causing microbes.
Right. It's all about manipulating those microbial communities in the soil.
So it sounds like we're learning to work with nature rather than just trying to fight against it.
That's a great way to put it. And that's really the beauty of biological control. It's about finding those elegant solutions that are, in sync with natural processes.
But of course, there are still challenges, right?
Yeah.
We talked about consistency earlier, that gap between lab results and real-world performance.
Yeah, that's a big one. Sometimes these biocontrol agents, they just don't perform as well out in the field as they do in the lab.
It's like that sourdough starter that works perfectly in your kitchen, but then you try to scale it up and it's disaster.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of, scaling up production in general.
Right. How do we mass produce these biocontrol agents in a way that's cost effective and maintains their quality?
And then there's the challenge of formulation.
Formulation, right?
We need to develop formulations that are stable, easy to apply, and, can withstand storage and transportation without losing their effectiveness.
It's like you're packaging those tiny warriors for a long journey,
Right.
making sure they arrive at the battlefield ready to fight.
And then, of course, there's the cost factor. We can't ignore that.
Right, because ultimately farmers are going to choose the solution that's most economical for them.
And biocontrol products, they often face stiff competition from those cheaper chemical pesticides.
So it's a tough sell sometimes.
It can be.
Okay.
And then there's the whole regulatory maze, you know?
The red tape.
It can be a long and expensive process to get these biocontrol products approved for use.
Especially for those smaller companies.
Right, so there are definitely hurdles to overcome.
But despite those challenges, both articles seem to have a sense of optimism about the future of biocontrol. And one of the things that they both highlight is the potential of molecular techniques.
Oh yeah, that's a really exciting area.
So we're talking about things like genetic engineering.
Exactly. So, scientists are using genetic engineering to enhance those beneficial microorganisms.
So we can actually tweak their DNA
Yeah.
to make them even better at fighting plant diseases.
Precisely.
Wow.
We can potentially enhance their ability to produce those disease-fighting compounds.
So it's like giving them an upgrade.
Yeah, or we can make them more persistent in the environment or help them adapt to different climate conditions.
So it's like tailoring them for specific challenges.
Exactly. And then another area that's really promising is the use of nanotechnology.
Nanotechnology. Aren't those like the tiny particles they use in electronics?
Right, but they're also being explored as a way to deliver biocontrol agents more effectively.
So instead of just spraying them on, we could actually encapsulate them in these tiny nanoparticles.
Exactly. And these nanoparticles, they can protect the microorganisms from degradation.
Okay.
They can help them penetrate plant tissues more effectively.
So it's like a stealth delivery system.
You could say that. So yeah, nanotechnology is opening up a whole new realm of possibilities.
It's incredible. So it sounds like the future of biocontrol is pretty bright.
I think it is. But, both articles, they also sound a note of caution.
Right, because there's always potential downsides to consider.
Exactly. One of the concerns is the possibility of unintended consequences.
Right, because we're dealing with living organisms here.
In introducing them into an ecosystem, it can have unpredictable effects.
It's like those stories you hear about invasive species.
Right, where well-intentioned introduction ends up causing more harm than good.
So we need to be very careful.
Absolutely. Thorough risk assessment is crucial before releasing any biocontrol agent into the environment.
And what about public perception? I mean, are people on board with this idea of using microorganisms to control plant diseases?
Well, that's definitely something we need to address. The word microorganism, it doesn't always have the most positive connotations.
Right. People might think of germs and disease.
Exactly. So there's a communication challenge there. We need to explain the science behind biocontrol in a way that's understandable and addresses those concerns.
Transparency is key.
And it's not just about educating consumers. Farmers need to be on board too.
Right, because they're the ones who are actually going to be using these products.
Exactly. They need the knowledge and resources to use them effectively.
So education and training are really important.
Absolutely.
It seems like we need a multi-pronged approach to really make biocontrol work. More research, better technology, and also addressing those social and economic factors.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a complex challenge, but I think it's one that's worth tackling.
And as we move towards this more sustainable approach, it's important to remember that biocontrol, it's not about completely replacing chemical pesticides.
Right. It's not an either-or situation.
It's about finding the right balance.
Exactly. Having a toolbox with a variety of options and choosing the right tool for the right job.
And always considering those broader environmental and ecological impacts.
Absolutely. It's about being responsible stewards of our agricultural systems, finding ways to feed a growing population without compromising the health of our planet.
And that's where biological control offers so much potential.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's about working with nature, not against it.
Well said. Well, before we wrap up, both articles also kind of hinted some really fascinating future directions for biocontrol. What are some of the trends and innovations that you think will shape this field in the years to come?
Well, we already touched on the exciting potential of molecular techniques and nanotechnology.
Right, those are definitely game changers.
But I think there's another aspect that's going to be crucial, and that's a deeper understanding of the complex interactions within these microbial communities.
So going beyond just identifying the good guys and bad guys.
Exactly. We need to develop a more holistic understanding of the microbial world and how it interacts with plants, pathogens, and the environment as a whole.
So it's like we need to map out those intricate relationships.
Precisely. And this is where disciplines like genomics, metabolomics, and bioinformatics come into play.
Okay, you're gonna have to break those down for me again.
Sure. So genomics, it's basically like reading the entire instruction manual for an organism, understanding all its genes and what they do.
Okay.
Metabolomics, on the other hand, is like analyzing the chemical chatter between cells. It looks at all the small molecules involved in their metabolism.
Okay.
And bioinformatics, that's where we bring in the heavy computational firepower to analyze all that data and make sense of it.
So we're talking about using big data to unlock the secrets of the microbial world.
That's a great way to put it. And by combining these disciplines with traditional ecological studies, we can start to build a much more comprehensive and nuanced picture of how these biocontrol systems work.
So it's like having a high-powered microscope and a detailed map all in one.
Exactly. And that knowledge will be invaluable for developing the next generation of biocontrol solutions.
So it sounds like the future of biocontrol is incredibly bright.
I believe it is. As research continues to advance, we're going to see even more innovative and effective solutions emerging from genetically engineered microorganisms to nanoparticle delivery systems.
Mm.
But beyond the technology, it's this deeper understanding of the microbial world that's going to be key. It's like we're entering a whole new frontier of scientific exploration, and the possibilities seem endless.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're just scratching the surface here,
Yeah.
There's so much more to discover.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's not just about the science either, right? There are these bigger questions that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, right. Both articles, they touch on this as well. This idea that we need a more holistic understanding of how these biocontrol systems work within the larger context of, agriculture and the environment.
So it's not just about finding the right microorganism and sort of setting it loose in the field.
Exactly.
It's about understanding the whole system and making sure that we're not creating any unintended consequences.
Right. We need to be thinking long term,
Yeah.
What's the impact on soil health,
Wow.
biodiversity, the overall resilience of these agricultural ecosystems?
So it's about thinking several steps ahead,
Absolutely.
making sure that we're not just, solving one problem, but creating others down the line.
Right. And this is where the concept of integrated pest management becomes really important.
Integrated pest management.
Yeah, IPM. Both articles highlight this as a key framework for biocontrol.
So what does that involve?
Well, it's about using a combination of tools and strategies. Biocontrol is part of it, but it's not the only thing.
So what else is in the mix?
Well, things like crop rotation, using resistant varieties, even targeted use of chemical pesticides when it's absolutely necessary.
So it's not an either situation. It's about finding the right balance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Using the right tool for the right job,
Mm.
and always considering that broader context, the environmental and ecological impacts.
It's about taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And that bigger picture, it includes us, humans.
Right.
We need to be asking ourselves, how can we create a more conducive environment for the development and adoption of these biocontrol solutions?
So thinking beyond the science and considering those social, economic, and political factors.
Exactly. What kind of policies do we need to put in place? What incentives can we offer farmers? How can we make sure that these biocontrol products are accessible and affordable?
It's about creating the right conditions for these tiny warriors to thrive, not just in the lab, but out there in the real world.
Precisely.
And it feels like there is, a growing awareness of the importance of these solutions, both among scientists and the public.
Yeah, I agree. I think people are starting to realize that, we can't just keep doing things the way we've always done them. We need new solutions that are effective but also sustainable.
And that's what I find so exciting about biocontrol,
Yeah.
It offers this glimpse of a different way of doing things, a way that works with nature, not against it.
It's a paradigm shift.
Yeah, it's about harnessing the power of these incredible microorganisms to create a healthier and more resilient food system.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. It's about recognizing that, we're not alone in this fight. We have these amazing allies in the microbial world, and the more we learn about them, the more we realize their potential to help us create a more sustainable future.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well, on that inspiring note, I think we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of biological control.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And to our listeners out there,
Right.
the future of agriculture is in our hands. And these tiny warriors, they're ready to help us build a better world.
Absolutely.